So now to a little bit of the biology of malaria. Of course, malaria is spread by Plasmodium parasites. There are 4 main species that cause disease in humans. As you know, the primary parasite in Africa is Plasmodium falciparum. And unfortunately, falciparum is also the most lethal human malaria parasite. And that's a big part of why malaria is a bigger problem in Africa than anywhere else. It's because malaria in Africa is nearly all Plasmodium falciparum. The reason for that, we understand somewhat, and I'll explain that to you later. Plasmodium vivax is the other common human malaria parasite. Outside of Africa, it's very common, but you don't see too much of it. We will come back to that. And then 2 much less common species are Plasmodium ovale and Plasmodium malariae. The life cycle of malaria parasites you probably are fairly familiar with. It's complicated. I'll go through this just very quickly. The details are not so important. You should just have a general understanding. Of course, you get malaria from the bite of an Anopheles mosquito, only one genus of mosquito. There are many other mosquitoes you see flying around that don't spread malaria. And the mosquito bite leads to parasites very rapidly going into your bloodstream and then going to your liver. In the liver, a small number of liver cells are infected. This does not make you sick, but parasites develop roughly over about 1 or 2 weeks, though it varies. And when the parasites have completed development in the liver, they rupture the liver cell, releasing merozoites, which invade red blood cells, and it's the red blood cell infectious cycle that makes you sick. All of the clinical manifestations of malaria come from red cell infection. And this cycle goes on for 48 hours in P. falciparum, different lengths of time in different parasites, and at the end of the cycle, parasites rupture the red cell and invade new red cells, so allowing increasing numbers of red cells to get infected, leading to illness. A few parasites go by a different route. They become gametocytes, the sexual stage of the parasite, and they are infectious for the mosquito. There's a complicated developmental cycle in the mosquito that we won't talk about, eventually allowing the mosquito to infect you. The time from a bite to a person getting sick at the shortest is a little bit over a week, though it can be quite a bit longer. The time for the entire cycle is about a month. Also, Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium ovale, 2 of the parasites you don't see too much, can also cause a dormant stage in the liver. So even after you treat the red cell infection, they can make you sick a second time if the dormant parasites in the liver then come out and infect red blood cells. That affects treatment, but again, that's mostly outside of Africa. When I think of the biology of malaria, I like to think of it in terms of 3 key factors, which are quite obvious: the parasite, the mosquito vector, and the human host. First, talking about the parasites. Malaria parasites have evolved with humans for many years and have figured out very clever ways of evading the human immune response, in particular Plasmodium falciparum, which is well known to sequester to avoid the immune response. That is, the parasite elaborates proteins on the surface of the red cell, which cause the infected red cell to bind to endothelial cells. The parasites bind in blood vessels. That way, the infected red cells don't pass through the spleen. Passing through the spleen would probably lead to removal of those red cells. And this is probably a main feature in why P. falciparum causes such bad disease, because you get very large numbers of infected red blood cells clogging up your blood vessels. Here are some old pictures. Here's a photomicrograph. This is a small blood vessel in the brain. The larger dark circles are white blood cells, but the very small dark blobs here are malaria parasites with pigment from the breakdown of hemoglobin, allowing us to identify them. Here's a brain sample from someone who died of cerebral malaria, showing you that dark pigment. The second factor in malaria biology is the mosquito. Remember, only Anopheles mosquitoes transmit malaria. Anopheles mosquitoes primarily bite at night, so malaria control measures are very much focused on avoiding mosquito bites at night. Of course, There are other diseases spread by other mosquitoes that bite during the day, such as dengue, Zika, chikungunya. So there are other things to worry about, but for malaria, it's night-biting mosquitoes. There are actually many different Anopheles vectors around the world, but it just so happens, again, Africa has the hardest challenge. Anopheles gambiae and some closely related parasites, such as Anopheles arabiensis and fenestis, are particularly competent malaria vectors. They really do well breeding almost anywhere. As you hear in Africa, they breed in a small hoof print that fills with water. They can breed in dirty water, clean water. They like to bite people more than other animals. And so compared to other parts of the world, the Anopheles vectors in Africa are probably the best at transmitting malaria and very difficult to control. The third factor in the biology of malaria, of course, is the human host. As I've already mentioned, the primary risk group is young children. Children get infected early and often in highly endemic areas of Africa. Many of them die from malaria. Most deaths are in young children. But after a few episodes, if children have survived them, and of course most children survive, then they're relatively immune and they're less likely to get sick. A second high-risk group is pregnant women. There are, during pregnancy, parasites are selected for individual strains that have that same adherence I mentioned before, that same sequestration, but this time they like to bind to the placenta. So with a first pregnancy, malaria is a particular risk. After the first pregnancy, women develop antibodies against those particular parasites that bind to the placenta, and then they're somewhat at less risk. They're at somewhat less risk, but with first pregnancies, malaria is a major risk. Though, of course, the main risk group is young children. This is a slide showing a photo from South America, but it also may be relevant for Africa now. Malaria is primarily a risk in young children in a highly endemic area, but for a population that did not grow up with malaria, such as these gold miners who grew up in a big city in Brazil where there is no malaria, and then they moved to the Amazon, they, for the first time in their life, can get malaria, and then their risk as adults of getting severe malaria is very high. And I think increasingly this is a problem in Africa. As malaria goes down in the big cities, people who live in the cities probably in many places have a quite small risk of malaria, but when they travel up country, they can have a much higher risk. When we think about malaria, a key distinction is Plasmodium falciparum and everything else. P. falciparum is the most common. As I said, it's by far the most common in sub-Saharan Africa. It has a high risk of progression to severe disease. It also has major problems with drug resistance. All the bad stuff is P. falciparum. P. vivax outside of Africa is common. It occasionally causes severe disease, but much less commonly than P. falciparum. It's starting to have problems with drug resistance. Ovale and malaria are very uncommon. You will see them occasionally in Africa, but relatively small problem, and they generally are treated when you treat falciparum. What's new with Plasmodium vivax is a few things. First, as I said, it's increasingly resistant to chloroquine now. So some of the same problems we've had with falciparum malaria for years, we now have with vivax. And we're a little more understanding that vivax can cause severe disease. So at a rural hospital in Indonesia, when people were admitted to the hospital with severe illness, they had, it was due to Plasmodium vivax as much as Plasmodium falciparum. Probably with vivax, it's less likely that the malaria itself is what's making people severely ill. It's probably more common that they have P. vivax in addition to some other clinical problem that's making them sick. While with falciparum, it's more the malaria itself that's making people dangerously sick. But nonetheless, vivax itself can be quite serious. The other thing that's new with vivax is we're increasingly understanding that it can occur in Africa. You see on the map, the areas in red are areas where there's lots of P. vivax malaria, most notably Ethiopia and Madagascar. But for most of Africa, we've generally said there isn't vivax malaria, and the reason is understood. It's because most Africans do not have a certain protein on the surface of the red cell called the Duffy blood group antigen. And without the Duffy antigen, Plasmodium vivax cannot invade the red blood cell very well. But we've learned just in the last few years that despite what I just said, some vivax can occur in people who do not have the Duffy antigen on their red cells. And from the yellow and green circles on this map, you see that vivax now has been identified across sub-Saharan Africa. The numbers are small. It's not a huge problem compared to falciparum, but it's an interesting new research observation. Probably in people who are Duffy negative, again, most Africans are Duffy negative, probably vivax cannot cause an advanced illness. It probably doesn't do that well. And that's why, even though it can cause infection, it hasn't been noticed. But we'll see where the research goes with this. There's another parasite, which you may have heard about, only discovered as an important human parasite within the last 10 years or so. That's Plasmodium knowlesi. We've always known about knowlesi, at least for many years. It's a monkey parasite, but it's now known to be a true human parasite. This is, again, is not Africa, so I'll mention this quickly, but you should know about it. It's an important piece of malaria now. In the right part of the world, where you have the right mosquitoes, which are this Anopheles leucospherus group mosquitoes, and you have the right monkeys, which are two different species of macaque monkeys. And the area that has both of those is right here, where you have the right mosquitoes and you have macaque monkeys. Then once in a while, mosquitoes bite those monkeys and then bite people and transmit the malaria from the monkeys to people. So this generally occurs in rural areas where people live fairly close to where there are monkeys living out in the bush. What's important is knowlesi was previously missed because on a microscope slide, it looks like Plasmodium malariae. It's only when we had molecular methods, such as PCR, that we could distinguish them. And what's important is this has a very fast doubling time of 24 hours rather than 48 hours. And probably for that reason, you can reach very high numbers of parasites in the bloodstream quite quickly. And this is quite a serious illness. So knowlesi malaria is a more dangerous illness than the other non-falciparum malarias. And it's responsible for a number of deaths in this part of the world, in particular, Borneo, this large island in Indonesia. Probably cannot be a problem in Africa, however, because we don't have the correct kinds of monkeys there.